Hello, everyone. My name is Lydia Kariuki, and I'm a senior scientist and content marketing specialist with CloudLIMS.com. Today, I'm very much excited to be taking you through an important discussion, which we have titled Surviving the Cost Crunch, Financial Best Practices for Cannabis Testing Labs. In the course of this presentation, we'll go over the key cost areas for cannabis labs. We'll also dive into some hidden costs, and we will be wrapping this up by looking at some strategies to help you manage costs effectively so that you can achieve profitability within the shortest time possible. So with that, let's get started. The economics of cannabis testing labs. A majority of people believe that cannabis testing is a gold mine. While that is true, it's not the entire picture. Cannabis testing has high revenue potential. However, it requires significant startup costs, and at the same time, operational costs can easily build up. This makes it very important to understand the key cost areas for a cannabis testing lab and then build a financial strategy that will enable you to keep these costs in check over time so that you can get into the green sooner rather than later. The financial realities of cannabis testing. As we have alluded to earlier, setting up a cannabis testing lab can be a capital-intensive venture. We are looking at the amount of money it takes to get the real estate, to get the right equipment in place, to get the right staff in place. All these are significant capital expenditures. Again, as we will see later, there are other hidden costs that come up and build up over time. For most labs, it actually takes between 1 to 3 years to break even. For some labs, it may take even a longer time. If you don't have the right financial strategy in place, you might even get to year 5 without you breaking even. This makes it very important to be able to plan ahead, as well as to set aside some funds to cover early operational costs before your lab is able to go into the green. So with that background, we can dive into the meat of our discussion today, which are the key cost areas for cannabis testing labs. The first one is real estate and lab space. We also have equipment, which, as you will see later, is a major capital expense. We have consumables and inventory. We have staffing, utilities, regulatory costs, and we also have waste management. Understanding these key cost areas will enable you to build a solid financial plan that will help you to keep your costs in check and get into profitability. Cannabis testing requires high initial investment, which goes into equipment, securing space, and also getting licensing. Again, additional costs will come in terms of staffing, utility, and getting the right informatics tools in place. So with all these costs in mind, where do you get the funding to set up your business and get it running? If you have some money put aside, that will be able to cover all this well and good for you. But for most businesses, they may have to rely on loans and investors. Most people consider cannabis as a high-risk investment, and mostly this is due to the regulatory situation with cannabis being a federally prohibited substance. So as much as you may be able to access loans, you may find that they're coming at a significant cost, and you need to factor this in. One of the strategies you can use is to get a loan that gives you a decent moratorium, let's say of about 3 to 5 years before you start paying the interest. If you don't do this, you may find that over time you're building significant costs that are going into repaying your loan. And this can easily bump up your operational costs and cripple your business before you get into profitability. In a nutshell, you need to be able to control your expenses early to avoid financial strain, especially during the unprofitable years. So with that, we can go into the first cost area for cannabis testing labs, and that is securing real estate. Cannabis is a highly regulated industry, and in most jurisdictions, you'll find that there are zoning laws that limit the availability of space for your cannabis business. Generally, cannabis businesses can't just operate in any jurisdiction. You'll find that you have restricted areas where you can open a cannabis business. That is including a cannabis testing lab. Due to this, you'll find that the cost of securing a space is significantly high. At the same time, you need to weigh this against the need to have a location that is accessible. And when you're looking at accessibility, we're looking at accessibility for your resources that you will need to get to your lab, accessibility for your staff, and lastly, accessibility for your customers as well. You may find a location that's significantly cheaper. However, it's not accessible to your potential clients. And this means that you're not able to reach a wider clientele. So this is also going to impact on your profitability. So when selecting real estate, you need to look at all this and balance these factors. How much does it cost? And if it's cheaper, does it limit your accessibility for your staff, for your potential clientele, and for your raw materials as well? Once you've secured the right real estate, now you need to consider the lab space. You need to design your lab space in a way that is compliance driven. One of the key requirements, because you would be having staff on premise, you need a facility that complies with OSHA regulations. That's Occupational Safety and Healthy Act. How safe is a place, is an environment for your staff? Do you have slippery floors? You have to look at waste management. Some jurisdictions will require you to have specialized HVAC systems. All this needs to be taken into consideration. Other than compliance, you need to ensure that your space is optimized for workflow efficiency. For example, you don't want to have a space where staff or samples have to keep moving back and forth to be able to go through the test cycle. What this means is that you're increasing your risk for contamination, and also you're impacting on the efficiency and you're wasting time in the lab. You can have a small space that is well designed so that staff and samples are able to move easily from one place to the other. This is very important when you're looking at the lab space considerations. And that brings us to the second major cost for your cannabis lab equipment. Equipment for a cannabis lab could possibly be the largest capital expense because you will require high-tech instruments such as the liquid chromatography, mass spectrometry, as well as the gas chromatography, mass spectrometry instruments. A single instrument, you'll be surprised, it may cost you the upwards of 300,000 USD per instrument. If you have 2 or 3, you can easily see how significant that cost is. And then apart from the initial cost of securing that equipment and bringing it to your facility, there are other costs that can easily add up as well. There's the purchase price, and then there's the cost of regular maintenance. You will have cost for repairs, and then you'll also have the cost for depreciation. Once you've brought the equipment to your facility, it begins depreciating. So that when you need to dispose of it, you'll find that the resale value could be significantly lower. So when you're looking at the cost of purchasing an equipment, you need to have a clear picture of the entire cost. And you may find that this cost, the cost of maintenance and repairs and depreciation, can easily add up to a third of the total cost of purchasing the equipment. So in the event that you don't factor in this cost, you may be wondering where your profits are slipping into. This is a possible place where they could be going to. So how can you manage equipment costs in your lab? Through preventive maintenance. Preventive maintenance just means that you're not waiting for your equipment to actually break down for you to come in and start doing repairs. It means that on a constant basis, you're bringing in people to service your equipment to prevent it from getting to a place where it's actually broken down. The cost of repairing an equipment that has broken down is usually significantly higher than the amount it may take you to regularly service the equipment. Therefore, while you may think by skimping on maintenance, you're saving some money, this may only apply in the short term. But once the equipment breaks down, one, you're going to lose business because for the time it's being repaired, your business may not be operational unless you have a backup plan. And at the same time, it may cost you significantly higher to fix the equipment. So when it comes again to managing equipment costs, when you're thinking about preventive maintenance, take your bit back. Some vendors will offer vendor service contracts that are tiered. You might have perhaps a bronze, a gold, a silver, a platinum plan. It's important to scrutinize the plan. While premium plans may offer you comprehensive coverage, they may come at a very expensive cost. You may decide to go with a hybrid model where you have some in-house staff carrying out the regular maintenance, which is not so intense. And then from time to time, you may have a third-party vendor coming in to fully service or repair your broken down instruments. But when getting a third-party vendor to do this, it's very important to ensure that they are familiar and they have the required expertise to service these instruments. As we mentioned earlier, we're talking about highly specialized instruments, mass spectrometry instruments. So you need to make sure that the people you're bringing in to do this servicing, if it's a third-party vendor, that they actually have the expertise to do this. So the equipment does not break down, and then now you need again to bring in the vendor to do the repairs. The other thing we've mentioned that this equipment is very expensive. You may decide to go to an option where you can lease equipment, where you're only paying perhaps on a yearly basis. And this may also cushion you from depreciation costs. Because in such a case, maybe you've leased for 5 years. If you want to upgrade, the company leasing to you may give you a new instrument or a better instrument. You just pay a subscription price without having to factor in all these other costs. The other option you might consider is buying used equipment, which may be significantly cheaper. However, should you decide to go with this option, ensure that the used equipment that you're buying is actually certified. And that brings us to the third cost, which is consumables. This is a hidden cost. Why? Because unlike equipment, which you need to pay an initial substantial amount, consumables are paid on a daily or weekly or monthly basis, depending on the structure that you have in place. Because of this, it's easy for you to assume that the cost is not significant. However, if you don't have a plan to track this expense, it may easily build up and into your budget. When you're talking about consumables, you're talking about reagents, solvents, lab supplies such as pipettes, because one thing that lab managers or the supplies department often overlooks is the quality of the consumables that they are purchasing. If you're looking at reagents, maybe when they're comparing two different price lists, if one costs $45 and the other one costs $50, it's easily to fall into the trap of going to the cheaper one, which costs $45. However, let's say you're looking at reagent and the quality of this reagent that's cheaper is of lower quality. This may compromise your test results. So over time, when you look at the picture of when your test results are not accurate, you're looking at possible fines, reputational damage, and other downstream effects. So when looking at the quality, it could even just be maybe glass beakers that are slightly cheaper, but they break more easily. So when you're looking at the price point of these consumables, you need to look at different things, not just the price point, but the quality of these consumables as well. And a good way to do this is through inventory management for cost control. This means that you need to be able to track the usage to avoid waste and shortages. And here I'd like to bring in the idea of buying in bulk. While it may look very appealing to buy in bulk because you get a cheaper price, this is usually not the full picture. One thing, you may buy in bulk and your the cash reserves you have are stretched. So you find that you have locked up a lot of money in consumables, and then you're not able to meet your other operational costs such as wages and perhaps leasing the facility. So you need to be very careful. You need to be able to have a good inventory management plan so that you're only buying in bulk consumables that move fast. Other than this, it's also important to have a cost analysis. This will enable you to even have the true picture of how much it costs you to carry out a single test. what's going into consumables, and then make sense of the numbers. Does the price point of this test actually match up the consumables that are going into this test? This will show you perhaps you're ordering from one vendor and they look cheaper, but perhaps their beakers or their reagents are used up faster or they break more easily, so the cost builds up faster. So it's important to have a regular cost analysis that will give you the true picture of how your consumables are moving and what makes sense. And this will also advise your price point. And as we will see later in this discussion, to be able to get a good control of your inventory management, it's important to have a laboratory information management system, a LIMS, in place. And let's move to the other cost, which is staffing costs. Now, cannabis, generally for any laboratory, you'll require highly skilled professionals. And the case is even more complex for a cannabis testing facility because, one, we are looking at an industry that's relatively new. So even when you get the best of the best, they may still need to be trained on other additional tasks. We're talking about regulatory requirements here, the documentation that's required. And then cannabis also has very complex sample matrices, and then a myriad of tests. We're talking about moisture analysis, potency testing, microbial testing, heavy metal testing. So you need highly skilled labor for this industry. And to be able to get this, of course, it comes with, you have to offer competitive salaries. And at the same time, you need a conducive working environment that will be able to maintain, motivate your staff, and even reduce the turnover. The importance of staff training. So you'll find that many new hires in a cannabis lab lack hands-on experience. The primary reason is it's a new industry. Chances are high as you bring in new hires, they've probably not worked in a cannabis lab. At the same time, this requires highly specialized instruments. We've talked about the mass spectrometry instruments. So as much as you may find scientists who have the theoretical knowledge, perhaps they've not had hands-on experience in these tests. This means that you have to constantly offer ongoing training to ensure compliance and efficiency. When you have staff that are conversant with the tests and the regulatory requirements, you can easily get into a situation where you have to do costly retests. You may go out of compliance and face heavy fines. You may have inaccurate results, which result in reputational damage. So these are things to look at. And it boils down to you need ongoing training to ensure compliance and efficiency. And we've said the cost of getting this staff to work in a cannabis lab is expensive because it's a highly skilled labor. And at the same time, they constantly need to be trained and uptrained. So how can you manage the staffing costs so that they don't eat into your budget? The first strategy to employ is to cross-train employees for flexibility. Let's say you have a staff who's well-trained in pesticide testing, ensure that they're also cross-trained in potency testing. Ensure that they're also familiar with the regulatory requirements so they're conversant with the documentation, METRC reporting. In the case when you don't have a lot of work, you can manage a lean staff and they can easily switch from one department to the other. In the case where one staff perhaps is not there, has left the company, you don't go into panic as you're trying to hire. Staff can easily fill up each other's roles. The other strategy, as we have alluded to, training can be very expensive. So you can adopt a hybrid model that balances between workshops and mentoring on the job. You can have experienced staff training and mentoring staff who are new. You can also have a hybrid between physical training and online training that can be a bit cheaper. And with such a hybrid model, it's easy to manage the training costs for your cannabis lab. That brings us to our fifth significant cost, which is regulatory costs. And this again is usually overlooked by many lab owners, or they underestimate how much money actually goes into regulatory expenses. To begin with, even before you open your doors, you will need to get licensed and you will need to pay licensing fees, which are also renewed perhaps annually. And this can be a significant cost. While this may vary based on the jurisdiction, the cost can easily go into tens of thousands of dollars. Apart from licensing fees, you also have audits that require a lot of documentation. And then you also have strict reporting requirements. In most states, you'll have to have METRC reporting. When you go out of compliance with MHRC reporting, you may lose money in terms of fines or retests. So this is something to always keep in check. Another significant regulatory cost is accreditation, such as the ISO 17025. This international standard ensures that labs meet strict quality and competence requirements. For cannabis testing labs, this means proficiency testing or third-party testing. It also means strict quality control measures, and it also means routine equipment calibration of your equipment. And all this can come at a cost. So what can you do to manage regulatory costs in your cannabis lab? The first thing to do is to start preparing early. Many lab managers are not aware of how long it takes to get accreditation. For example, for ISO 17025, it may take you anything between 6 months to 1 year. So if you wait until you open your doors, you may find that you cannot go into business, you can't start your operations for another 6 months to 1 year as you wait to get this accreditation. One thing you can do is now to start your accreditation as soon as you start rolling out your business, even before you open your doors. For example, as you're designing your lab space, ensure that it's in compliance with all the required regulations. While you're purchasing your equipment, make sure that you have the right equipment and the right protocols in place that are compliance driven. And at the same time, when you're hiring your staff, make sure you're training them as you move along so that they're conversant with the required documentation and record keeping protocols so that they don't cost your business when they come in and they're not in compliance in their processes and procedures. That brings us to our final cost, which is waste management. Now, cannabis labs generate a lot of waste, including solvents, reagents, and plastic consumables, among others. When you're looking at waste management, we can look at it from two different angles. One, the more waste you generate, the more expensive it's going to be to dispose this. At the same time, there is compliance. When you dispose hazardous waste and go against the regulations, you are at risk of facing heavy penalties. So as much as you're paying to dispose of waste, if you don't dispose of hazardous waste in the appropriate manner, again, you may be going into fines and other hefty penalties. And this can be a cost that can easily eat into your budget. So how can you minimize this? The first one is minimize waste through efficient sample prep. Train your staff to make sure that they are conversant with the right way and the right sample prep for carrying out tests so that they are not repeating tests unnecessarily. They're not wasting reagents that have to be disposed of. They're not wasting samples. And at the same time, you also want to make sure that you have the right protocols in place for disposing hazardous waste so that you're not getting penalized for this. And lastly, you can implement a recycling and sustainable disposable programs. If you're not purchasing consumables such as plastics and glass, you can go for options that may be slightly more expensive, but they are more sustainable. And you can also partner with a certified recycling program, and this can significantly bring your costs for waste disposal down. And that brings us to the end of that part. We've gone over the key cost areas for cannabis testing labs. So as a lab manager, you need to have a clear picture of which are your key cost areas, and then develop a strategy that ensures that all these key cost areas are catered for, and you're keeping your costs low. And those are both the obvious and the hidden costs. We've talked about your real estate, equipment, staffing costs, waste disposal, regulatory requirements. So you need to have a clear picture of all this and plan ahead for them. And the picture you should be having by now is a cannabis lab can be a very complex system to manage. When you're the different kinds of tests you're carrying out, the sample matrices can be complex, talking about highly specialized instruments, talking about different kinds of tests for every sample that comes in. So how can you as a lab manager have a system where you have everything in check? Documentation is in check, the test protocols are in check, the staff are well trained, they're carrying out the tests according to protocols and procedures. How can you keep all this in check? The easiest way to do this is to have the right informatics tools in place that are going to support this process. And in this case, we're going to talk about having a laboratory information management system in place that supports this process. How can a LIMS help you manage costs in your cannabis lab? To understand this, let's first look at the different kinds of LIMS that you can have for your cannabis lab. And there are two types. The first one is an on-premise LIMS. This means you have a LIMS in place whose infrastructure is hosted within your lab. And this comes at a significant upfront cost. And as we have mentioned previously, setting up a cannabis lab comes with significant upfront costs in terms of getting the real estate, getting your licenses, getting the right equipment. Now you can't avoid these costs. So it may be prudent to go for a LIMS that's offered on a third-party basis and does not bump up your initial capital expenditure. And that brings us to the second kind of LIMS, which is a third-party LIMS, or a LIMS that's provided by a third-party vendor. Usually, this is paid for on a subscription basis. It could be monthly or yearly, and hence does not come with a significant initial investment. And what does the LIMS offer your lab? It will be able to manage large volumes of complex data that's coming in. It will also enhance traceability and reduce errors. The LIMS will automate sample tracking and reporting. It will also speed up processes while ensuring compliance. So when getting a LIMS to support your lab, you need to make sure that it's able to offer you all these services at a minimal cost, so that you're keeping, you've automated your processes to ensure efficiency and even to speed up the process and to increase productivity. But at the same time, make sure that the cost of getting this LIMS is not significant and is not bumping up your operational costs. And that now brings us to the second point, which is the hidden cost of a LIMS. Once you choose to go perhaps to the third-party LIMS, you could find that as much as the subscription is not significant, there could be other hidden costs. Here we're talking about technical support and training, instrument integration, product upgrades, reporting templates, legacy data migration in case you need to move from one LIMS to another, and then data backups as well. These can be hidden costs that comes with a LIMS. So once you get your LIMS, you need to ask yourself again these questions. You don't want to be bumping up your operational costs. What's the full cost of acquiring these LIMS? Fortunately, some third-party vendors will offer you this as complementary services. If this is not the case, you need to find out how much they cost and if this makes financial sense for your lab at the end of the day. So we can say in a nutshell that obtaining a LIMS is necessary, but this can also become a key cost area if you don't make the right financial decision. Now let's come to the third part. We have looked at the key cost areas. Now we need to look at contingency planning. What can you do to ensure that the costs in your lab do not build up significantly over time? And the first one is have a plan in place to always ensure that your business is running. Have a contingency plan in place. You can do this by diversifying your suppliers to prevent disruption. Don't just rely on one vendor. What happens when they either are not able to have the supplies you need, or maybe they bump up their prices or they go out of business? What happens? It's important to have a contingency plan or a plan B to be able to come in and fill this gap. The other importance of having an alternative vendor is you benefit from pricing leverage over time. It's always good to compare prices and have a plan B that may be able to offer you better prices. The other thing is to maintain backup equipment for critical operations. Well, you've said that cannabis equipment is actually significantly expensive. So while it may not be feasible to have a secondary equipment, you can have a plan with your vendor where they're able to provide you with an extra instrument as they're repairing the other, or just have a contingency plan in place to make sure that you have continuity of your business when your equipment is perhaps not working or is being repaired. One of the biggest financial mistakes that labs make is underestimating, is not having financial reserves or not planning for unforeseen disruptions which may come in. For example, you may have a major customer pull out, and this may affect the continuity of your business. In such a case, you may also have regulatory changes that may affect your business or your cash flow. So in such a case, it's always important to have a financial reserve to tide you over such periods. And one strategy to do this is to always adopt a lean operations for long-term sustainability. This just basically means having a plan where all your expenses are in check. Over time, as profits begin coming in, you'll be able to set aside some money to build your financial reserve. A cannabis business that is operating on razor thin margins may not be able to weather some financial storms when they arise. Hence, you'll find that you are forced to close down your business, while in the event that you had some financial reserve, you'd have been able to tide over the period as you wait to go back into profitability. Again, we have to talk about staffing. We talked about staffing as a major cost. And a contingency plan that we mentioned is cross-training your staff to make sure that in the event maybe one staff has left the company or maybe is unwell, you can be able to have staff that can move from one department to the other. Or you may have a period where your lab is not so busy and you don't need a big team. So if you have a team that's cross-trained, you can manage a lean team and they can be able to handle all the tasks in the lab. The other thing is to invest in structured training that's not so costly. Develop a hybrid model where your staff is trained, maybe through workshops that are costly, but at the same time, you also have a mentorship program that's ongoing where some staff can train, who is more experienced, can train new staff. You can also have some online classes that may be a bit cheaper. And the last part in contingency planning, we have to talk about your inventory management. And we mentioned this as a silent cost that may not look significant, but can easily build up and into your budget. You need to maintain a critical inventory reserve to ensure that at any one point you're in touch of how much you're spending on inventory and it's actually making financial sense. And the best way to do this, we talked about having a LIMS in place that will enable you to monitor your inventory, to be able to advise you on perhaps inventory that makes sense to be purchased in bulk and what doesn't make sense to be purchased in bulk. And when talking about a LIMS, we talked about please get a LIMS that's still cost efficient. It could be a low capex LIMS, meaning a third-party LIMS where the capital expense is not significant. At the same time, please bear in mind the hidden cost of a LIMS. How much does this actually cost you to have these LIMS in place? Are there hidden costs that may come in terms of staff training, upgrades, instrument integration? Have the full picture of that in mind. And that now brings us to the end of our discussion today. We've gone over the key cost areas. I hope you've understood the key cost areas. You've understood the obvious and the hidden cost in these key cost areas. I hope you've gotten some ideas on how you can manage these key cost areas. I hope you've also understood how our LIMS can help you manage the key cost areas. And also, I hope you have an idea of how you can implement a contingency plan to ensure that your costs are kept low and that your lab is able to get into profitability sooner rather than later. So the key takeaway was we've talked about the key cost areas. We've talked about implementing cost control measures. And we've talked about facilitating strategic planning and budgeting. So to truly survive the cost crunch, what must cannabis labs do? They must focus on financial resilience. This means long-term financial planning should be prioritized over just short-term measures to cut back on expenses. You also need to invest in the right tools, such as the LIMS. And lastly, you need to manage your lab operations well. The truth is that cannabis testing is actually a gold mine. A well-managed lab can be a very profitable lab. However, you need to have the financial strategy in place. I hope you've learned one or two tricks to be able to get your lab to the green sooner rather than later. You don't have to actually wait for the 3 years if you have the right strategy in place. And at this point, I'd like to thank you so much for being a part of this presentation and hope to interact with you at a later date. Have a lovely time.